11:30. I like to start when it's to start for those that get here on time. So welcome everybody. And I don't know who all's muted. You don't have to mute, just if there's a lot of background noise at some point, then you can mute yourself. But I want to thank everybody for taking the time to join us today to review the standard agreement of sale. I had told Nathan, I know that PAR has a resource and they call it guidelines for preparation of and use of different standard documents, that any document we provide through PAR. So I pulled up the guidelines for preparation and use for the agreement of sale, and guess how many pages it is?
55 pages or
55 pages. So I had gone through earlier in the week and just highlighted some things, and it's the same stuff without taking 5 hours for this presentation. So we're going to get started, and we all know we're going to be reviewing the agreement of sale here today. And two things before we get into that, and anybody can chime in here. Before your client enters into the agreement of sale, what two other documents need signed prior to that? It used to be just one until COVID hit. That's the
consumer notice and the
COVID access acknowledgement form. Remember, we're still in COVID. And back when the Department of State was sending out best practices and guidance for real estate companies, PAR came out. We developed two new forms due to COVID, and one was the COVID access acknowledgement, which just says, hey, COVID's out there. Here are some things for you to know about it. And even though we've been into this for 9 months or however long, it still should be signed prior to showing them properties, let alone entering into the agreement of sale. Consumer notice, we all know, to get signed prior to. At the first substantive meeting where you have a conversation about them buying a property or selling a property. Any questions on any of that? Good. All right, we're going to get into the agreement of sale. I think, well, one other point I wanted to make, and Nathan and I talked about this yesterday or the day before. There was the legal column that comes out from GAR or PAR. And I might forget the attorney's name who did the last one, but he said, best advice is read the contract. And sometimes I question how many of us actually sit down and read through the documents we're having our clients sign. And it's the best thing you can do to prevent yourself from liability. It really is. So we're going to read this today, and I hope I don't bore you to tears, but that's how we're going to approach it. Page 1 is always just the who's who in the agreement. No science here. Buyers, make sure you have the buyer's full address. Seller, same thing, make sure you have their full address and their names as they would appear on their deed for the sellers. Under the address, pretty self-explanatory, of course. I noticed in the guidelines from PAR, they said, just make sure, be certain to include the correct municipality. I don't know why that's come up. Either it's a township or it's a borough or it's a city. Not just the commonly referred to post office. I guess that, like down in Edders, where that's the post office, but it might be a Lewisberry or Newberrytown address. Another thing that PAR put out is, in the school district, if it's not filled in, or you're the listing agent and you're receiving this offer from the selling agent, and they have the school district incorrect for whatever reason, one of their helpful hints is if the buyer fills in the school district incorrectly, or if the buyer has not filled it in at all, the seller should modify this line to reflect the accurate school district. That's pretty important to most buyers. That, you know, they may think, I've had a client where they thought they were buying in one school district and it wasn't. The address looked right, but they were in the wrong school district. The next section in page 1 is just the relationship. Who do we represent? This is the disclosure to everybody. Here's who I represent. We're going to assume in this class that we're the buyer's agent, okay? So we're the buyer's agent, so the broker, Keller Williams. And again, we have to fill these in as we are licensed with the state. So we're licensed with the state as Keller Williams of Central PA. Your name, company license number. Tammy and I, in reviewing contracts months ago, this came up quite frequently that was not filled in. It's easy to find our company license number through the MLS. I'm going to just throw it out there for anybody who may not know it or wants to put it in their phone or what have you. Our license number for the office is RB 065950. The company address has to be the company address where we are licensed with the state again. So it's the main office, either you're in Enola or you're in Carlisle, you can use either one, but it's that street address. Company phone and fax, we don't even really use fax much. Company phone should be in there. The fax, I see it in there. I see it sometimes not. I don't find that to be a huge deal anymore. And then after that, we check who we represent. We are the buyer's agent. Broker represents the buyer. Then you have your licensee, your license, your information, email. Now, I've had some conversations about this next part with a couple people, and they argued with me from different, well, so-and-so agency says we have to be a buyer's agent and I said, no, we don't. That is why they made the change. Gosh, I don't know how many years ago, but quite a few years ago, to allow buyer agent with designated agency. That's what we practice. Here's the reason. In the older 90s, 80s, you were a buyer's agent. That's all there was to it. That was your only choice. That meant everybody in the company represented that buyer with the same fiduciary obligation as you did working with them. Same way with the seller. Not realistic, is it? It's not. Now, what designated agency allowed us to do, and we check that box, is broker designates Katie to represent that buyer. She has the fiduciary obligation to that buyer, but not every other agent in our office. Okay, makes sense? And anytime someone has a question, just you know, blurt it out. We'll cover them as they come. So anyway, we do practice buyer agent with designated agency. And again, I've had a couple debates with people that said, no, that's not right. And it's, you know, but it is right. And then the seller's relationship with the licensed broker, you know, you would fill that information in, find the license number. Where's the company license. Try to always fill that in. And if you have the agents, most everybody puts that in the, you know, multi-list now, so it's accessible. Now, what happens if we represent the buyer, but the seller, for whatever reason, is unrepresented? Maybe it's a for sale by owner, and they said, okay, we'll entertain your offer. Then you would need to check that there is no business relationship. Seller is not represented by a broker. Okay. Once in a while, you may become a transaction licensee where you're providing services. However, there's not the same fiduciary relationship as if you had a buyer agency agreement or a listing agency, exclusive right to sell agreement with that seller. Dual and or designated agency. Okay, so this is kind of important, and I know that we don't encourage dual agency, but sometimes it's happened. I've done when had a development where we were the home builder and buyers would come in. There were a fair amount of times I ended up on both sides and became a dual agent. And with full disclosure, it's still allowed in the state of Pennsylvania. You can do it. We don't encourage it if we can avoid it. But just to read this, a broker is a dual agent when a broker represents both the buyer and the seller in the same transaction. A licensee is a dual agent when a licensee represents buyer and seller in the same transaction. All brokers, licensees are also dual agents, unless there are separate designated agents for buyer and seller, which we practice. If the same licensee is designated for the buyer and seller, then that licensee is a dual agent. By signing this agreement, buyer and seller each acknowledge having been previously informed, previously being the key word, previously informed of and consented to dual agency if applicable. So that's the disclosure. That's by signing this, that's what proves that they had prior knowledge of the dual agency and accepted it. And there are some companies that just say you should not practice dual agency. The State Real Estate Commission, however, is at this time it is permitted type of agency. All right.
Kevin, this is Donna, and I have a question.
Yes.
When you are either receiving an offer or placing an offer, and do you assume, if we are in this case buyer agent, do I assume that the seller agent is also seller agent with designated agency and check that box?
Yes.
I usually do.
Yes.
But I have received it when I'm on the selling side and they place it and they leave my box blank or they check it wrong. So then I usually correct it. And when you're in that initial offer, I assume any change, if they give it to me incorrectly or whatever, I need to go back and still get everyone's initials. Is that accurate?
That is true. And you do need to check that. I've seen exactly what you're talking about with co-brokes checking that we are buyer agent and don't check the box that says buyer's agent with designated agency.
Mm-hmm.
And I have seen that. And
Okay.
And then that's when I questioned it and got into a debate with one of these co-brokers.
Okay. So when I'm placing an offer for that seller, always assume they are also seller with designated agent. That's how I've always done it. But I just wanted to reconfirm because I've heard two sides also.
Okay, what was the other side when checking the seller?
The other side, I was told, and it was actually in a training at our office when I was a newer agent. I just always like to brush up here. That's why I'm here. I was told we were always supposed to check seller agent, all company, licensees represent seller for both sides. So I'm glad you addressed the question because it makes sense what you're saying to me, and that's how I've done it. So.
Yeah, the whole gist again of that was under the old terms. I mean, every agent in that office represented that client.
Okay.
It's just not, in my mind, practical.
I have a question as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hey, Kevin, I have a quick question.
Yes, Katie.
So let's say in a situation, I'm writing an offer and you have the listing and we're from the same brokerage. How does dual, because somewhere I was told that dual agency on the left side for the brokerage is to be checked. Can you clarify that?
I think I understand your question. Let's go back. Let me go back up to that.
Do you know what I mean? Like,
I think I do.
For the brokerage, for the buyer's relationship, seller's relationship with the broker.
So if I represent the buyer and Katie represents the seller, how do we check that box?
Right.
Because we both work for Keller Williams.
Right.
Yeah, so,
Yeah.
so for Keller Williams, we would check that the, whoever represents the seller is the seller's agent with designated agency. And the only way you would have a dual agency if you had a buyer with designated agency selling their own listing, basically. So just because it's with Keller Williams, that would not make it.
Okay, now I was told, for example, on the left side under the broker, not the licensee, but the broker side, that if
Okay.
we are both agents with the same office, that dual agent.
Oh, yes, 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 yes. Under the broker side.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I didn't understand.
No,
the
that's
question.
okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so we would in that case select both the dual agent with designated agency on the left side under the broker area.
Cool. Oh, no, I didn't understand. You know what? I would say no. I would say that you would check buyer's agent. Okay, it's Keller Williams.
Okay.
You would check under broker, buyer agent. Keller Williams under seller, seller agent.
Okay.
But I want, that's a good question though, but I'm 99% sure. Yeah, because of designated agency. Okay. Thank you. Let's go to page 2. Okay, so we're all pretty familiar with page 2 of the agreement of sale, the date, the purchase price. The only note on the purchase price would be you put the numerical amount where it has the dollar sign. And then like you would write a check, $100,000 and write that out. That would be on the next line in the parentheses. Under initial deposit, just always know there's that 5, this agreement has a lot of already default timeline.
How are you?
So in this case, the initial deposit is due within 5 days of the execution agreement, execution date, unless it's specified otherwise.
She went to the doctor. Anne Marie and she
Hey,
went
Kevin,
back soon.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Anne Marie, they asked me to.
So for the purchase price, we have a lot of these escalation clauses that are happening. So let's say that there's an escalation clause and they change the
Water,
price.
and I think she's got.
Do we change the price on the contract also?
The escalation clause addresses that.
So
So-
we would not need to do it on this?
No,
Okay.
that addendum becomes part of the agreement of sale, and it states in there that the mortgage contingency paragraph,
Yeah, it's cool, but better than what it's.
as well as the sale price, gets changed. Now,
They went
could
to
you
the
go
doc-
back and clean up the whole thing later? Yes, you could, but
No,
but-
just back up.
the, Kathy, can you find out who that is and mute them?
Do you want the lid off?
That's Donna, yeah.
Want it in a cup or just like that?
So,
Pretty nice out.
no, and we can look at that, but the escalation clause I know addresses that. It says the agreement of sale is hereby changed to such and such. So
Okay.
if you know your client's not going to get a deposit in within the 5 days specified, then you give them more time, but that typically has not been a problem. Additional deposit within so many days is exactly what it says. And then it just simply says the remaining balance will be paid at settlement. It used to have a little add and subtract on there, the old contracts, and you'd have to actually put the dollar amount that was due at settlement. This is much better. It just says that all funds by buyer. Here's an important part that we run into some challenges with. All funds paid by the buyer, including deposits, will be paid by check, cashier's check, or wired funds. Here's the important part. All funds paid by the buyer within 30 days of settlement, including funds paid at settlement, will be by cashier's check or wired funds, but not personal check. So anytime we get an escrow check that's 4 weeks out, or less than 4 weeks out, then Nathan comes to me and it's my decision if we're going to take that personal check. And what I look at is it Orrstown Bank, or is it Fulton Bank, or is it an out-of-town bank? If it's a local bank and I know it's going to clear within that, we'll make an exception, but otherwise we want a certified check if it's within 30 days of the closing. Now, under where that deposit's held, it's held by the broker for the seller. Does it have to be? No, doesn't have to be. A lot of times, well, sometimes, new home builders want the deposit. They want to hold the deposit, and it's a substantial deposit. And some people say, well, you can't do that. The broker for the seller has to hold the deposit. No. If both parties mutually agree otherwise, then it's okay. So that's why it says, unless otherwise stated here, and that's where you'd put in held by Yingst Homes, to be held by Yingst Homes, who will retain the deposit in an escrow account in conformity with all applicable laws and state regulations until consummation or termination of this agreement. Now, here's something interesting. Only real estate brokers are required to hold deposits in accordance with rules and regulations of the Pennsylvania State Real Estate Commission. So if it goes to Yingst, they don't have to set up some, I don't think they're held to any of the same rules. Paragraph 3 is seller's assistance. I don't think any of us have any questions on that or how to
Kevin.
fill that out.
Kevin, real quick, I missed what you said goes in that blank there, applicable laws and.
State regulations is the
State
only thing
regulations, okay.
I want to circle back to that with the state. It's going to be hard to find it. Okay,
That's okay.
that's what I would put in there.
Okay.
Settlement and possession date. Oh, one thing PAR says on the seller assistance, make sure you check with your lender that you're not going over the maximum allowed by that lender.
Mhm.
I've seen cases where the seller agreed to pay $10,000 of the buyer's closing costs in negotiating the agreement, and the lender would only allow 8, and the buyer did not get 2. Once it's on there and you're at settlement. So the buyer was sitting there with $2,000 they couldn't use. Settlement and possession, settlement date is or on or before if agreed upon by both the buyer and seller. You can always settle earlier, we all know that. What's everybody seeing as an average from execution of the agreement of sale to closing date these days? I used to always put 60 days in there, but now I think people are moving them up a little bit.
Nate McWilliams with Fairway has been saying, in general, 45 is not unusual. They could do
That's what
30.
I've been seeing.
Yeah. Tammy, you're seeing 45?
Yeah.
Sooner the better. You know, things happen, and I'm always a fan of closing sooner than later. So that's something you have to know a little bit about with your situation, your lender, your buyer situation, the seller situation. But I think the average you'll see is 45 to 60 days.
Kevin, I have a question about this area here. If you have a circumstance where you're writing the offer and you know that the seller needs, X amount of time, 2 months or whatnot, and you
Right.
want your offer to be appealing, do you still have to list a date in here, or is there another way that you can write something in that area to show against other offers that you are flexible?
That's a great question. And the PAR guidance says do not put, or here, I have it right here. Settlement date is on or before blah, blah. Always fill this in with a specific date. Do not use 30 days from acceptance or similar terms. When selecting a settlement date, the parties and agents should be careful to consult a calendar and avoid setting settlement for a weekend, holiday, or other day that may cause difficulty, such as a religious holiday or family obligation, blah, blah. This provision establishes a specific date for settlement that may only be changed by the agreement of both parties to extend beyond that date, etc. You know, and I've been in situations personally where I had to put something like C addendum because it was a really strange situation. So are there exceptions? Yes, they say always put a date, not 60 days after such and such or 30 days after something else occurred. So I would try to pick a date if you can. And if you're trying to accommodate a seller, how would,
Maybe when you present the offer, that would be the appropriate time to explain,
Right.
you know, we listed this date, however.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah, exactly. And you can always put a date in there and then see attached addendum.
okay.
And then spell some things out in the addendum. So we have the proration, paragraph 4C talks about the proration of taxes, interest, rents, homeowners association fees, water sewer rates, that kind of thing. Title company handles it, but it's in there. And then it talks about in D, it just talks about the municipal tax bills run on a calendar year, school tax run from on a fiscal year, except I'm just seeing Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Scranton. Surprise, right? Conveyance from seller will be of simple deed of special warranty unless otherwise stated here. There is a thing called a general deed. And sometimes, you know, people say, oh, on a general deed. Well, general deed says the seller is free, has not encumbered the property, and they're guaranteeing the previous property owner didn't through their title insurance. This covers it, and 99% of the time, that's what'll stay in there. Just, you don't have to fill anything in. Now, 4F says that the payment of transfer taxes will be divided equally between the buyer and seller unless otherwise stated here. It's kind of traditional that the state transfer tax, which is 2% in the state of Pennsylvania, is split between the buyer and seller. Doesn't have to be that way. There's nothing that says it has to.
Seeing,
Our standard agreement says it'll be, unless you put something in that blank. Tammy,
yeah, I've been seeing the buyers actually paying both sides.
is that right?
Yeah, a lot.
To
It's a
make
little
their offer
squeaky.
more,
Yes.
Yep.
wow. It's a different, our world has changed a little bit in just, what, 9 months?
Yeah.
A little more than that?
Yeah.
And would you just write buyer to pay sellers 1% transfer tax, or would you write buyer to pay full?
Buyer will pay the 2%.
Okay.
Pennsylvania real estate transfer tax. I think Philadelphia, it's a fairly high amount just for the city, another transfer tax, 3% or something. Okay. You know, so it goes on to say, I'm sorry. We lost you.
Mhm.
All right, I'll keep going. They can interrupt me. Okay, possession will be delivered by deed, existing keys, physical possession to a vacant property, free of debris, with all structures broom clean. Well, what the heck does broom clean mean? Just that, you know, they can't leave a mess, and it's to be free of all this stuff. And we get into situations once in a while where the seller leaves things behind, and hey, right here it is in the agreement, you're to deliver this empty, broom clean. We want $1,000 to get somebody to clean it up. That's one of those, unfortunately, you have to have mostly at settlement, because you're doing your pre-settlement walkthrough when you find it out the day or day before.
Does this count for like having your driveway plowed? Because we ran into this recently as a buyer's agent.
I'd say no.
Okay, because I know Valerie had indicated that they probably should have their driveway cleared because it was a vacant home and we had no way at our wall to get into the driveway.
Yeah, I don't think that would legally hold water,
Okay.
but yeah, it would have been nice. Tenant occupied property addendum. Of course, that deals with just that, and that could be a single family home that's leased out. Doesn't have to be a multi-family home.
Question. I am on the selling side of well, it was a vacant property that was rented out and the tenants left a lot of things behind, and the sellers are elderly and they just didn't get in there to get anything out. I did put, now I'm trying to remember, this is like my first transaction, so like everything I can't remember, but I did put somewhere that all personal property conveys, just to let them know that it like wasn't going to get cleaned out. And they haven't said anything about it yet. So am I sellers covered there, or are we going to run into a problem?
Well, now you get into the Landlord Tenant Act. So
Well, it was vacant for over a year.
Oh, you're fine.
So it was abandoned property.
Yeah, so the
So-
tenant has a certain amount of time, and I can't remember right now, it's at least 30 days to
Right.
get their things out of a property before the landlord can do anything with them. And if,
Right. Well, that's not
Okay.
it's just the people,
okay,
the buyers go, oh, now we want this junk out of here after we've done all this other stuff that's going on.
right.
So, yeah, like I said, I'm sorry, I don't really remember. Somewhere somebody told me to put personal property conveys, just so that, it wasn't, they just knew that they were getting all that stuff too.
I think that was good advice. That's great. Yeah, that
Would
was
you have
kind of
to- Would you have to put a signature block, or not a signature, but an initial block next to that?
I'm just trying to remember where I was told to
Yeah.
put it. Yeah, I'm looking on my.
well, you
paper.
could put it on the last page of the agreement of sale where you have special clause.
Yeah.
Excuse me,
Okay.
special clauses.
Okay, maybe that's.
You
what
might
it
have put it in there, and then it's checked. And you don't need an initial in that case, but if you're writing it in to answer Philip's question, you've negotiated the contract, you're writing it in somewhere after you have, it's like a counter offer, then yes, you need initials. Anytime you change anything after the initial signatures, or if it's a counter of any kind, we need initials and a date too.
Yeah.
All right, so the rest of this, time and dates of the asset or of the essence. This just goes on in D&E to say, hey, no one's extending anything unless it's agreed by both parties and in writing. And in this agreement of sale, there are time periods that are pre-printed as a convenience. They are negotiable by striking or putting something else in there. Okay, so we're on page 3, and zoning is interesting. Unless the property is zoned anything except for single family dwellings, you have to put what zoning classification the property is in. And even in the guidelines, it says it doesn't hurt to put either NA here or put residential. Even, if it's single family residential, you don't have to. I, as a habit, always just put that in there. Just always know the zoning and put it in there. Doesn't hurt anything. Because it goes on to say that if the buyer or seller does not put this in, or the buyer doesn't put it in, and it's something different, it can make this agreement voidable at the buyer's option. And if voided, the buyer gets all their deposit money back. So I'd go fill it in and then you're covered. Fixtures and personal property. The only thing I would say about this whole thing is read it and have your sellers read it, because there's things in here like gas fireplace logs, sound equipment, hardware for television mounting, something with the window treatments, where is it? Storm windows and screen storm doors, window covering hardware, shades and blinds, awnings, central vac with attachments, built-in air conditioners, etc. So, and fuel oil. I've had that come up a couple of times where the seller took part of their heating was with a wood stove and they took all the firewood. Well, contractually, that's a little gray, but it's really not. They were to keep that there. And same with gas or fuel oil. And then in C, we know to put anything that may be subject to a lease or financing agreement. And the biggest thing that's come up lately are the solar panels. So people are getting these solar panel companies are financing these things for, I don't know, long periods of time. People are selling their houses. They're under this contract with the solar company. They still owe $10,000 on it. And the new buyer doesn't want the solar panels or the debt of the solar. So I've seen some interesting ones there, but just be careful. That's always noted if you're representing the seller or buyer. The mortgage contingency. Gary Musio had a class, I forget how long ago, really pointed out some great things on this that I guess I didn't think about or have it in my head correctly. But we'll go down through it. So you have your loan amount, you have your term in years, and then you have your type of mortgage. It's important to put in that loan to value ratio, what it is not to exceed. And it's important to put in there the mortgage lender that because now you're saying, okay, we're only going to go up to this loan to value. We're only obligated to go to this lender. And I had a co-broke with one of our agents where they said that buyer has to go to another lender. I said, no, we don't. It says right here, it's contingent upon us getting the loan with Members First or whomever. That there's nothing that says that we have to contractually, legally, otherwise. But anyway, this is protection for you as a buyer's agent to make sure we put the interest rate, what the maximum interest rate percentage they're willing to accept, and the maximum loan to value. Gary's point was you don't need an appraisal contingency if you have that loan to value in there, because if it appraises differently than your asking price, you've exceeded the loan to value, that's your out versus the appraisal contingency. It doesn't hurt to have appraisal contingency, but I thought that was a very good point he had made. If it's FHA-VA, you have to fill in the second part of that, discount points, loan origination fees, loan placement and other fees charged by the lender, excuse me, as a percentage of the mortgage loan, not to exceed blank percent of the mortgage. You'd have to almost get that from the lender up front. Then B is upon receiving the documentation demonstrating lender's approval. Now here's key part, whether conditional or outright. So what's that mean? Well, any of us that have been around a little bit, you see the commitment from the bank, it's almost always got conditions on it. Now it can have 5 conditions or it can have 50 conditions, but if you have an approval, whether conditional or outright, of the buyer's mortgage application in accordance to the terms set forth above, buyer will promptly deliver a copy of the documentation to the seller, but in no case later than. So what are we putting in for that now? If we're settling in 45 days, you'd almost need that in 30 some days, right? And if you're settling in 60 days, you would you would want to have that in about 45 days.
This is an
Now-
actual, this is an
Go ahead.
actual date too? It's an actual date, not 45 days though, right?
Correct. It's a
Okay.
date.
Okay.
Something interesting in the legalese that follows, some people don't know, is if the seller doesn't receive that mortgage commitment by that date, they can terminate the agreement by written notice to the buyer. And that right to terminate continues. I'm sorry, I lost.
Yeah, just. it's the third
Continues
line.
until the buyer delivers the commitment to the seller. The seller's right to terminate also continues if there's a condition in the commitment. Well, let's just read it. Yeah, okay, so the seller can terminate if it doesn't satisfy the terms that we made it contingent upon, where it says first mortgage, all our terms. Or it contains any condition not specified in this agreement. Buyer must settle on another property, an appraisal must be received by the lender, or the approval is not valid through the settlement date. That is not satisfied and or removed in writing within 7 days after the date they received those conditions in the mortgage commitment. So that's something I don't pay attention to in a contract or transaction, that I follow. Okay, I got a mortgage commitment, I'm happy. Look at the conditions, nothing really weird in there, I'm okay. But the seller has the right to terminate it if those conditions aren't met in 7 days from receipt. Interesting, right? Does that ever get used? I've never seen it. Seller typically wants to sell, but it's just something to kind of know in the back of your head is there. And then it goes on to say that if the agreement's terminated because the buyer in essence can't get their loan, no fault of their own, all deposit monies will be returned to the buyer and this agreement will be void. Now it goes on to say, hey, Mr. Buyer, contractually, you're responsible for all those costs you had up to this point. Sorry, but you're going to get your deposit back. Talks about loan to value. Paragraph C of this is more of a disclosure. You can read it. The interest rate and fees provisions in paragraph 8A are satisfied if the mortgage lender gives buyer the right to guarantee the interest rate and fee at or below what they stated. If lenders gives buyer the right to lock the interest rate. Now here's something, again, we don't really focus on, but if the lender gives the buyer the right to lock in the interest rate, buyer will do so at least 15 days before the settlement date. That typically happens anyway. Buyer gives seller the right, it's seller's sole option, is permitted by law, and the lender to make contributions to make the mortgage work. We know that. Now, here's one that Gary kind of enlightened us on as well. And that's in this mortgage contingency paragraph sub E or ED. Here's one that gets passed by, I'll bet, 90% of the time. Within blank, here's another standard date, 7 if not specified days from the execution date of this agreement, the buyer will make a completed mortgage application, including payment for and ordering of credit reports without delay for the mortgage terms and to the mortgage lender identified in paragraph 8A, if any, otherwise to a responsible mortgage lender of buyer's choice. Broker for the buyer, if otherwise broker for the seller, is authorized to communicate with the lender to assist in the process. And I think we all know this, but you have the right as the buyer's agent, or I mean, the seller's agent, broker for the seller, if any, is permitted to contact the mortgage lender at any time to determine the status of the mortgage loan application. Sometimes, how about it, Tammy? We get co-brokers that say, you can't call my lender. Well, I sure can. It's in paragraph 8. Or 8E. It's in paragraph 8E. Right there it is. So some people don't read this little bit in here, and that's why I'm boring you to tears going over it. That 7 days gets passed by a lot. So I would just, if you represent the buyer, I would put a little more time in there. And if you represent the seller, what's the seller going to do? I don't know, but it could come up. It's just an awareness thing. Know that it's in there. You'll be smarter for it when you go up against co-brokers. Buyer will be in default of this agreement if buyer furnishes false information. Yes, had it happen. Fortunately, I can count on one hand how many buyers that I've seen through our agents or co-brokes or what have you that misrepresented their finances, were denied the mortgage when the truth came out. And one, they threatened to investigate him because he threatened to sue for discrimination. They said, you gave us false information. I don't think you want to go down there, but you know, that's your right. If the mortgage lender, yeah, here's another little timeline we don't pay attention to. If the mortgage lender on a property and casualty insurer providing insurance required by the mortgage lender, key, requires repairs of the property, the buyer will deliver a copy of those requirements to the seller within 5 days. Doesn't happen that often, so that's probably why that's not a big deal. And then it goes into the what if. Seller can make the repairs or not. Okay, under FHA VA, this is the disclosure where, and then VA and FHA have their own HUD documents that the seller signs, the agents sign. But it's just, the main thing in here is that it has to appraise at the sale price, at or above the sale price, or no less than the sale price. And then one thing I saw in PAR's notes I thought was worth mentioning. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, notice to purchasers, buyer acknowledgement. Buyer has received the HUD notice for your protection, get a home inspection. I don't, Tammy, do we have that in our PAR forms? Do we have the, for your protection, get a home inspection, the HUD's form? I don't think so. I think it comes from HUD, which the lenders have.
That's correct. Lender has.
Yeah. So just so you know, that's in there, that the buyer's signing, they received that notice. If they've already been in front of their lender would have provided that if they're doing an FHA or VA loan. But you're checking that box and, you know, you're going to have to make sure they get it. But I don't know that we've ever had to follow up on it. The lender takes care of that.
Hey,
That's
Kevin,
not applicable for a conventional
Actually,
loan?
Kevin, we do have it in the under PAR. It is in there under the PAR document.
It's just not the HUD form. It's our own form.
Right.
That's fine.
It's
Just have,
PARs.
you want to make sure you have them sign that in an FHA VA deal.
Kevin, can I ask another question?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so up there when you're filling in the FHA amount for the purchase price, I was told before that if you are doing an escalation clause, that you are to use what their maximum escalation was to in this area. Is that correct or not?
Well, it would, if you have $100,000 in there now, so your VA and you have $100,000, that's your loan amount. Or I mean, that's the amount the property would have to appraise at. If that same buyer has entered into an escalation clause willing to go to 105, again, that escalation clause, and I don't have it in front of me to be 100% sure, but it should automatically raise that price in the agreement of sale.
So when you're writing your agreement, we can just leave it as the original purchase offer.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah, because you don't know what's going to happen with the escalation,
Right.
first of all. Second of all, the escalation says everything in the mortgage contingency and the purchase price in the page 2 gets bumped up to this.
okay.
Oh,
Okay. Again, we're still in the mortgage contingency. It's a pretty long part of the agreement, a lot of fine print we don't always read, but paragraph 9 says, look, if you're a buyer and your financial status has changed that may affect your ability to get a loan, you have to disclose it to the seller. And a change in financial status includes, but is not limited to, loss or change of employment, failure or loss of the sale of the buyer's home, buyer having incurred new financial obligation or obligations, entry of a judgment against the buyer. Buyer understands that applying for incurring any additional financing obligation. So if they go out and buy a brand new car while they're under their mortgage underwriting, that may affect their ability to purchase. Most of us know to tell the buyer, don't do anything between contract and settlement. Don't be furniture shopping, don't buy appliances, just don't be messing with your credit. You can go out and get all your new stuff after you close. And I've heard a lot of lenders tell them the same thing.
yeah.
Sellers, okay, so paragraph 10, now we're dealing with the seller's representations. Are we on public water, community water, on-site water? Okay, a lot of times today's world, we're on public water and we're on public sewer. But I don't know if I've ever seen community water. I might have. On-site water is your well water. And then if you have an individual on-lot septic, there's different kinds. So if you go down through paragraph 10B2, notice is pursuant to the Pennsylvania Sewage Facilities Act. It describes these different scenarios. It's so, if you're dealing with rural properties, pay a lot of attention to this. If you're not, be aware of that it's in there if you get into private septic systems. And we're going to talk a little bit about private septic systems in the home inspection section. There's some interesting things I've seen that, you know, I might give you some examples to avoid problems down the road. Historical preservation, is the house under any historical preservation restrictions? Disclose it. And then your land use restrictions, same thing. Agricultural area security law, portion of it in preferential assessed for tax purposes under the following acts. Okay, so I'm sorry. Property or portion of it is subject to land use restrictions. So if because you're getting preferential tax treatment because you've agreed to restrict the use of your farm for development or your forest land, or the conservation reserve programs 5 to 10 years where you can't use your property for certain things and you get a tax break. If that property falls under that, then you check those boxes. Again, a very rare thing, or I haven't seen it much, so just know it's there. And then it goes down to describe all those things. So it goes, okay, here's the Pennsylvania Right to Farm Act. Here's the Clean and Green program. I think most of us are familiar with Clean and Green, right?
Mhm.
So you sign up for Clean and Green if you have more than 10 acres and you get a discount on your land portion. And then if you take it out of Clean and Green, however, you pay some of that back, depending on the timing and how long you've kept it out. And then it talks about the Open Space Act and the Conservation Reserve program. Again, a lot of these programs go from anywhere from 5 to 15 years. and carry penalties if they pull them out of those programs prior to. So that's why it's important. The seller discloses it and the buyer knows about it so they can find out what those taxes are. I've run into this with development land with Clean and Green. We're pulling it out of a farm to potentially develop. And wow, 30,000 in rollback taxes for Clean and Green.
Amazing.
Be aware of that. Make sure you know what those amounts are. And you can get it from the county typically. Paragraph E just talks about the real estate disclosure law in Pennsylvania. If you have 1 to 4 units, you have to fill out the seller's property disclosure law or disclosure form, with the exception of some that we'll talk about later, estates, bank-owned homes, new construction. Are there any public or private assessments that buyer may not know about? So this is just saying that the seller has not received any notice of public improvement, condo or homeowner associations assessments. Hey, you owe us 10 grand for the new roofs. No government or public authority has served upon the seller. And they've also not received any notices of any violations of zoning, housing, building, safety, fire. That's pretty much covered in the SPD also. Highway occupancy permit. I don't know why that's in here for residents. It says access to a public road may require issuance of a highway occupancy permit from PennDOT. Okay. Oh, here's a new one. That again, we've had some discussion on. Paragraph H under the seller's disclosures. I like what they call it, Internet of Things, or LOT devices. I'm going to read it. The presence of smart and green home devices that are capable of connecting to the internet directly or indirectly, and the data stored on those various devices make up a digital ecosystem in the property, sometimes referred to as the Internet of Things. I'm old, so I never heard of that before. Buyer and seller acknowledge that LOT devices may transmit data to third parties outside of the control of their owner. On or before settlement, seller will make a reasonable effort to clear all data stored on all LOT devices located on the property and included in the sale. Interesting. Seller further acknowledges that all personal devices owned by the seller, included but not limited to cellular telephones, personal computers and tablets, having connectivity to the LOT devices located on the property, will be disconnected and cleared of relevant data prior to settlement. Further, no attempts will be made after settlement by the seller or anyone on seller's behalf to access any LOT devices remaining on the property. Did we all know that?
I heard that from a different point of view, because I mean, not those details, if you will, but I've heard that now they're talking about privacy, recording of conversations while you're in the house and things like that. And then from the other side, as a buyer's agent, tell your client, when we get inside, don't talk about stuff like that because they may have this, that, and the other thing.
Just assume we're on video and
That's right.
Audio.
Yeah.
Now,
Yep.
Video is not illegal, but to record a conversation is
Yes.
very
And
much.
Can I ask, is this specifically talking, like, let's have an example. There's a camera on the property that the seller is leaving there and now the buyer is going to be keeping it, but the seller has recordings from that device previously stored on their phone or computer. That's what has to be cleared.
Yes.
That is correct. And how many people do you think really go to a lot of trouble to do all this?
Where to find out?
I mean, I think we have to really, there's a whole new level of educating our buyers with all this new technology and these recordings. And yeah, okay, so somehow, you know, I'm buying it. I'm not tech savvy. I don't know. I left the cameras up. I left everything as it was. And they're videoing and recording, you know, your household the whole, you know, 2 weeks after settlement. I don't know. People wouldn't do that. You know, no reasonable person. But I'm just saying that's the concern that, you know, it's a thing of privacy and making sure there's an attempt in the agreement of sale to add teeth to the fact that, hey, seller does have an obligation if they have these devices to clear them out, delete the software from their laptop, their phone, whatever. It's going to continue, I think, to be an evolving thing in our contracts. Okay, paragraph 3 of this. Following settlement, buyer will make a reasonable effort to clear all stored data from any LOT devices remaining on the property and to restrict access to said devices by seller. So the buyer also has an obligation here contractually. Seller's agents or any third party to whom seller may have previously provided access. Oh, okay, comma, okay, got it. This includes but is not limited to restoring LOT devices to original settings, changing passwords or codes, updating network settings, and submitting change of ownership and contact information to device manufacturers and service providers. This paragraph will survive settlement. Wow. So, I mean, that's a lot of work to do for somebody, and it's a lot of work for somebody to follow up on. Maybe not as much as I think, but this is one paragraph we all need to be very aware of. Make sure your buyer reads it. Make sure your seller reads it and understand what it's saying and say, you know, it survives settlement. So if this device is recording Sam after he moved in 2 weeks after settlement, and they find, you know, I don't know what the consequences will be other than, you know, you got to scrub it and get it cleaned up. All right, paragraph 11, if you waive something, you waive it, basically. If this agreement is contingent on the buyer's right to inspect for all those things, their failure to exercise any of their options within the time frame. Now, this we run into sometimes, not as much, but as we used to. These timelines for the home inspections are so important. If you represent the buyer, and bottom line is, if you represent the buyer, you don't respond to the seller in writing within those timeframes, your buyer just waived it and released. That's it. They waived it. And they agree to the release in paragraph 28. We had a situation where a co-broke, we represented the seller. They had a septic inspection. They got the septic inspection. They sat on it, didn't do the proper paperwork, went past the date, and then found out the septic failed. And they came back and they said, we want the seller to replace the septic system. And the seller was pretty shrewd and said, you just waived it. Here's the date you had to have it back. So now what happens? Well, then the buyer's agent's in a bad spot. And the buyer has a choice to lose their deposit or put in a new septic system, or no good choices. So I tell everybody, you got to really, really set up a, you know, everybody should have some kind of a calendar. Tammy, I know, has one, and we used to have like a chart, and you'd put in there all your deadline dates just so you don't miss them. Under paragraph 12, now we're getting into the home inspections, and it just says seller's going to provide access to whomever needs to get in there to make these inspections, and that they're going to have, they're supposed to have the heating and utilities on, including water, for the inspections and appraisals. A lot of people moving around, they vacate the house prior to even putting it on the market, and the utilities are off, or it's winterized. Well, it's the seller's responsibility to unwinterize it for a home inspection. They have to have the ability to run everything that the buyer's asking for in the report. And this time of year, you get into that. They've winterized the house. Now you have a home inspection coming up. All right, we're all familiar with these inspections, right? What they are, what they mean. Does anyone have any questions on things like the deeds, restrictions, and zoning? We all know what home inspections are. We know what wood infestation is. We know about water service, radon, septic, property and flood. Not many people check the deeds, restrictions, and zoning, but it's an option of the, and where it came into play for me big time was such as in-law quarters. Good friends of mine who wanted to move their 80-plus-year-old parents in with them. And we had to build a house with an in-law suite. And it was interesting how many places you cannot do that unless it's attached and the builder's creative.
If you
Property
have,
boundaries. Go
well,
ahead.
I was gonna say with deed restrictions, if they put, I'm not sure even, I'm just trying to think of, I know you can add little things here and there. We can't, I don't know. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I know that sellers, homeowners can add restrictions to their deed. I'm trying to think of what would make sense to be an example, but how do we know that? I mean, is that going to show up in title search?
It'll show up in the title search.
Okay.
And it's amazing to me how many title companies in a development I developed in Dillsburg don't provide the buyers with the restrictive covenants and the whole home rules, regulations, restrictive covenant, the whole homeowners, it's filed. I have the deed book, the page numbers, and they go, we never got it. We don't know anything about these rules or regulations. It wasn't my responsibility to give them to you. My responsibility was to disclose they were there.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times I'll put it in as a document, associated document, but the title companies, why aren't they actually going over these condo and homeowner docs with these people? I don't know. Maybe they don't feel it's their responsibility. At least provide a copy for them. And maybe they do. Now it's on a thumb drive, like the buyer's going to run home and look at it. Read the condo docs, all 50 pages of it.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, here's an interesting one. Regardless of whether this inspection is elected or waived, talking about lead-based paint, the Residential Lead-Based Paint Hazard Reduction Act requires a seller of a property built prior to 1978 to provide the buyer with the EPA-approved lead hazards information pamphlet titled "Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home." So I think we all know that the magic year is 78. Prior to that, lead-based paint addendums need signed. I haven't had anybody test for lead paint yet. Has anybody heard of it?
No.
Okay. And then this next paragraph D just talks about some of the challenges they've had with different things like mold, fungi, air quality, environmental hazards that are possible. It's again, just disclosure to a buyer. IFAS, that exterior stucco looking material they used and had some problems with. That's kind of some of what they're talking about in the exterior. And then it goes on to give them places to get more information. Now, the inspection contingency period is 10 days from the execution date of the agreement of sale. Know that the definition of the execution date for purposes of any timeline is not the date it's executed, it's the following day. I ignore that because that gives me 1 day of cushion. But just know that. And it says that in page 2, we could go back to it, but it says, hey, when we're considering these timelines for any timeline in this agreement of sale, we consider the execution date, not the date that it's signed, but the following day. Basically what it said. So if I have a property I sold on private well and septic, would 10 days be enough for me to get a septic tank pumped, inspected, get the report, get the water tested, sample taken, water sent to the lab and back, and a report and buyer review and get it back to the seller with a response in writing? No. If you have private well and septic, you should extend that by double, 20 days. Because again, remember, if you miss that deadline without a response to the seller, and that response can be say, hey, I need more time. We're going to extend the contingency period 10 more days. But I've seen it missed, and then the buyer waived all their rights to these remedies with the home inspection. All right. So it's saying within that 10 days in this case, if the results are satisfactory, okay, let me back. In all cases, these say that the buyer will give a copy of the reports to the seller. That's come up, Tammy, remember? No, I don't have to give you the report. Yes, you do. That's kind of new in the contract, but yes, you do. So every inspection you have to furnish a copy now to the selling agent, to the seller. So they either accept it, or they just flat out reject it, or the buyer writes a corrective proposal. And that proposal then, following the contingency period. So you have the 10 days. At the end of 10 days, then you have 5 days for the seller and buyer to negotiate those repairs. And if at the end of the 5th day of the negotiating period, the seller does not acknowledge it or answer anything or agree to satisfy, then you have a 2-day negotiation period. At the end of that 2 days, it's very important that you get your buyer to terminate the agreement of sale, because they will lose their money. If the seller still is not responding, or the seller's agent, and now you've used up your 10 days, your 5 days, you replied in writing on the 10th day, 5 days, nothing's getting done. And in 3B, it says, if no mutually acceptable written agreement is reached, or if seller fails to respond during the negotiation period within 2 days, if not specified, again, you can plug something else in, but within 2 days following the end of the negotiation period, buyer will either accept the property and agree to release it, or terminate and get their deposit monies back. In bold print, it says if the buyer and seller do not reach a mutually acceptable written agreement, and buyer does not terminate this agreement by written notice to the seller within the time allotted in paragraph 3B, buyer will accept the property and agree to the release in paragraph 28 of this agreement. Ongoing negotiations do not automatically extend the negotiating period. So I've run up against this myself. We're out of time, and I don't have a choice. I have to send the termination to the selling agent just to protect my buyer. And then if we want to extend that negotiation period, we can. And usually that's what would happen. But, paragraph C, a lot of the rest of this contract goes faster, but if the report reveals the need to expand or replace an existing on-lot sewage disposal system, the seller may within, again, 25 days is pre-done for you. Seller, within 25 days of receiving the report, will submit a proposal to the buyer. That's not a lot of time either, but it has to get done. And that proposal will include, but not be limited to, the name of the company and provisions for payment, including retests and a projected completion date for the corrective measures. And then within 5 days of receiving the seller's proposal, or if no proposal was given within that time, the buyer will notify seller of their intent to agree to that or void the contract. And then there's some more little timelines in there. So if you find yourself in a situation where with home inspections, okay, you have a septic, make sure you read that whole thing and your buyer reads that whole thing. That's the key. Here's another little timeline that'll get us in trouble. Title survey and costs. Very few know or pay attention to 14A, which says within blank days, 7, if you fill nothing else out in here, it's 7 days. From the execution date of this agreement, the buyer will order from a reputable title company for deliver to seller a comprehensive title report on the property. Upon receipt, the buyer will then give that report to the seller. How many of us really pay attention to how many days from execution we've ordered our title insurance? Tammy does. I knew Tammy did. Yeah, that's why people pay you to monitor their contracts. You've got a system. I have to put a plug in for Tammy. I've never seen anything like it with her, and just paying attention to all the dates and being back on the case with the documents and everything. I'm probably her biggest challenge when I have a contract. Okay, so the rest talks about, title insurance and what it'll be, but just, and again, that was pointed out in a class we had here at Keller Williams, that 7-day period is in there. And for whatever reason, the seller wants to get out of the contract and they can prove that the buyer's agent or buyer didn't order title within 7 days. You have something. Oil and mineral rights, we don't get into that much, but if there are that transfer with the property, you have to have a oil, gas, and mineral rights addendum signed and made part of the agreement of sale. Coal notice, haven't had it come up yet, but I'm sure there's parts of the state where it's more prevalent than here. Private transfer fee obligation. That's where you're transferring mineral, or there's something with your lease with the natural gas company or the coal company or the, whatever else. And you have to transfer the rights of those mineral rights to the buyer, and there's a fee. That's what that means. But again, I've never seen it in our area. Paragraph 15 just states that if basically if seller received any or receives any notices from any government official that they've got to put a sidewalk in out front, or they got to hook up to water, sewer, or something like that, within 5 days of them receiving that notice, they have to provide it to your buyer. And then the buyer has 5 days to say, hey, I agree with this or I don't. And they have the right to terminate and get their monies back. And again, a lot of timelines in there. Just pay attention to those and read them. I think we all know what condominium and planned home community association notices are, or that we check this box for whatever it is. It's either a condo or a planned community. If it's neither, which you have a rural property, it won't be.
Hey, Kevin, can I interrupt for a second?
Sure.
This is Ed.
Hi, Ed.
Back up to 14, title surveys and costs.
Okay.
Item A, within blank 7 days is not specified. Is that what a salesman usually do for you?
I'm sorry?
I
Would
said,
that
isn't
be?
that what Salzman and Hughes would do for you? Get their
Yeah.
title insurance and everything?
Yeah.
Okay,
Mhm. Yeah, I would just, I'm not sure I like the 7 days because I don't know that we, okay, again, I'm picking on Tammy here, but she monitors this stuff. On the typical agreement of sale, to what's executed, turned over to you, you get the file. Is it reasonable that within 7 days that title insurance is ordered?
They get the file going as soon as I give it to them. They let me know. They say, awesome, we'll open the file. And that's all they really have to do is open the file.
That's true.
that you're covered then if they just open it.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
but Tammy,
Yeah.
that's what Salzman and Hughes would do for you, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, gotcha. All right, thank you. All right,
But,
Thank you.
somebody's got to get it to them
yeah,
within that 7 days. And to me, that's not a very long window.
yeah,
When I'm thinking title, I'm thinking down the road a little bit. At least that's how I used to.
yeah.
And now I pay attention to that a little better.
So should we put something else in there besides 7?
You can put anything you want in there. I mean, I think 14 days is reasonable to order your title. As a listing agent, I'd be more worried. I'm not as worried about my seller providing clear and equitable title as I am
Yeah.
them getting their mortgage. So if
Right.
you came to me and I was the listing agent and you said, I want 14 days in here, and you put it in and they don't even notice it and sign off on it, I wouldn't balk at that.
Okay.
I can't imagine they would, Why are you worried about your title and your property?
Yeah, right.
Thank you.
Okay, so we talked about notices, we talked about condo plan communities. These are more just the disclosures. But then we get into, again, more timelines, but so the following applies to initial sales of properties that are part of a condominium or a planned community. Again, got to read this stuff, but if this is the first sale of the property after creation of the condo or planned community, therefore a sale by the declarant meaning developer, seller shall furnish the buyer with the public offering statement no later than the date the buyer executes this agreement. So really what we used to do with condominium communities, we'd give if we knew an offer was coming, we'd give them the public offering statement prior to them even writing it to let their buyer review, because there's a rescission date. That once they receive that packet, I think they have 15 days. It says here 15 days. They can void the agreement after they receive the public offering, or 7 days after they receive the packet for the planned community or homeowners association bylaws and things. And they usually, if it's the initial first sale, it's the developer handling all that and their sales team. So it's the resales that we're going to talk about next. Within 15 days from the execution of this agreement, the seller at the seller's expense will request from the association a resale certificate. I'm guilty of missing that deadline. But yeah, you have to, you're thinking down the road, a closing, but the contract says 15 days after it's executed, you, the selling agent, are going to order the resale certificate from the condominium or the homeowners association.
Yeah.
'17 talks about real estate taxes and assessed value, pretty straightforward. Says owners may appeal the assessed value of property at the time of the sale or at any time thereafter. A successful appeal by the taxing authority may result in higher assessed value for the property and an increase in taxes. Taxing authorities, I'm sorry, and property owners may appeal. Maintenance and risk of loss is always on the seller. So from the time the seller enters into an agreement of sale, this just says that they're on the hook if there should be some major, a fire, So there's a fire at the property and it's either partially damaged or totally damaged, totally gone. What are the buyer's choices? Again, a lot of people don't know that the buyer can take the property with the insurance proceeds. So what paragraph is it here? Or the seller has the right to make repairs. If any of the part of the property, including the sale, fails before settlement, okay, they can repair it. Oh, seller bears the risk. It's paragraph C. Seller bears the risk of loss from fire or other casualties until settlement. If any property included in this sale is destroyed and not replaced prior to settlement, the buyer has two choices: accept the property in its then current condition, together with the proceeds of any insurance recovery obtainable by seller. Did you know that was in there? Or terminate this agreement by written notice to the seller with all deposit monies returned to the buyer according to the paragraph 26. So how often it's going to happen? I hope never to any of us. But if you have a house you have under contract and something disastrous happens, there's a clause in there that you can check into what insurance recovery is obtainable by the seller, and you're at least give your buyer that option. Paragraph 19 just says we're going to tell everybody they're disclosing that there's home warranties available from third-party vendors, and that's our disclosure that they're available. 20 is we won't record, neither party will record this as public record or assign it to another party without the other's written permission. Governing laws provide is 22. We're not part of the any foreign investment group or anything. Notice regarding sex offenders, Megan's Law, they can research different websites to check on that. At all representations, they didn't, the buyer did not rely solely on an ad they saw or something else, but they actually inspected the property before signing this agreement, or has waived the right to do so and agrees to purchase the property in its present condition. Okay. Default termination return deposit. We have had I don't know, more discussions and more activity on this paragraph of the agreement of sale than I remember ever having. Okay. Paragraph A just says, if the buyer has a right to terminate this in any part of this agreement, they have the right to do so, get their money back, and this agreement's null and void. Paragraph B says, regardless of the apparent entitlement to deposit monies, Pennsylvania law does not allow a broker holding deposit monies to determine who is entitled to the deposit monies when settlement does not occur.
Mhm.
And we fielded a lot of calls from buyers saying, why don't I have my money, or sellers saying, why can't we get this resolved? The key is the broker's hands are tied. They can only release deposit monies, number one, if this agreement is terminated prior to settlement and there's no dispute over the entitlement of the deposit monies. A written agreement signed by both parties is evidence. That's what our termination and release of deposit monies is for. I just signed 2 of them this morning. It says, here's the buyer, here's the seller, here's why they're terminating. Then at the bottom, it says, here's the release, and the monies go to buyer or monies go to seller. With that, we can release it to the parties. That's one way. Number 2, if after the broker has received deposit monies, the broker receives a written agreement that is signed both by the buyer and seller, directing broker how to distribute some or part of the money. Again, buyer and seller have to agree. Or buyer and seller never reach an agreement. Had this happen, it goes to court, and I get an order from a district justice saying, this is a court order. Now, there's always the appeal time frame. So 30 days or whatever, I still have to wait until that appeal time's over, check, make sure nothing else was filed. Then I can release those monies. Or according to the terms of a prior written agreement between the buyer and seller that directs the broker how to distribute the deposit money, if there's a dispute. Those are questionable, whether most agencies would based on one of those agreements. And I haven't seen any, so. So now here's the one that you want to make sure you point out to your buyers. If you're going to highlight one, 26C, when PAR changed their forms, they put a blank in here and they put a timeline on these disputes of escrow money. Buyer and seller agree that if there's a dispute over the entitlement to deposit money that is unresolved, blank days, again, it's pre-printed 180 if not specified. If you represent the buyer, I would put 30 days in there every single contract. I've had 2 last year where we had to wait out the 180 days. And then there's more, but I would put 30 days in there. Speed it up. On termination. Oh, here, this is interesting. So after that 180 days, or when you put your 30 days in there, after 30 days, there's a dispute who gets the money back. Neither party are agreeing. I get it. No, I get it. Now, after 30 days in our case, hopefully, the settlement date stated in paragraph 4A or any written extensions thereof. So if it was extended, whatever, but 30 days after any extensions or settlement date or following termination of the agreement, whichever is earlier, then the broker holding the deposit monies will within 30 days, here's key. And I don't know how many people know this is in here, but we've had to deal with it a couple of times. Broker holding the deposit monies will within 30 days of receipt of buyer's written request distribute the deposit monies to the buyer unless the broker is in receipt of verifiable written notice that the dispute is in subject of litigation or mediation. I've had 4, I think 3 or 4 in the last year and a half or so with these. And it gets interesting. And we have one right now where we have an agent desperately trying to get the money out. This time period went by. The buyer, based on our advice, wrote the letter to the selling agency broker saying, I want my money released. It's an astute law firm owns the property. And they're saying, no, that we wrote a letter back in the fall. We consider that. And there's a big dispute. It wasn't a notice of litigation. It wasn't, they missed mediation by 5 days in our calendar. And Berkshire Hathaway is holding the deposit. Their legal counsel is saying, we're not comfortable releasing it. We're saying, well, you have to. It's, you know, so anyway, just know all that language is in there. It's pretty wild. And it only comes up when you have a problem. And I think we resolved a couple, and I think we have two left. But that 180 days, thank God it's in there. They changed the contract because it used to be, there was no time frame. I had escrow money sit in our agency for, I think the longest one I have is 15 years. People just left it go. I couldn't release it to anybody. No one would agree on it. No one wrote back. It just sat there, and, you know, I don't like that. I like to get them out, but that's all in there for the protection of your buyer. Should the seller say, well, I'm just not going to agree to release your deposit. I want to keep it. Representing the buyer, you would always check that the seller is limited to retaining the sums paid by buyer, including deposit monies, as liquidated damages. That used to not be in there. And, you know, there was a thing called performance, specific performance that the buyer could sue the seller for, the seller, the buyer. They just say, we're not doing it. Now, you know, that's in there. It limits the buyer's liability. Some attorneys won't agree to it if they're representing an estate, but paragraph 27 says that mediation exists through our local association of realtors. And the main thing to know here is that we agree to go to mediation before we go to court. Says buyer and seller will submit all disputes or claims that arise from this agreement, including disputes and claims over deposit monies, to mediation. Mediation will be conducted in accordance with rules and procedures of blah, blah, blah. Unless it's not available, we have it available. In which case buyer and seller will mediate according to the terms of the mediation system offered and endorsed by the realtors. There's fees. This mediation process must be concluded before any party to any dispute may initiate legal proceedings in any courtroom. There's some exceptions to that, but I had cases where, again, it was about deposit money, and the it drug out forever, and the buyer finally went to a district justice. The district justice got the contract, and he said, no, in accordance to paragraph 27, you have to go to mediation first. I can't hear your case. Found that interesting. So, you know, that's in there, be aware of it. And 28 is your general, we hold everybody harmless and release them from liability after everything's done here, met. Believe it or not, paragraph 29 is a mandatory disclosure item for real estate licensees in the state of Pennsylvania. You must tell, or the rules say you're to tell buyer and seller that there's a real estate recovery fund that exists to reimburse any persons who have obtained a final civil judgment against a Pennsylvania real estate licensee, their affiliates, due to whatever, and you're unable to collect from the individual or agency. Communications with buyer and seller says, if you're an agent, you're communicating to the buyer's agent, you just communicated to the buyer, and vice versa. Now, special clauses, this could be a whole nother class on forms and addendums and escalation and everything else, but that, I don't know, I hope that helps. Some things maybe you picked up you didn't know were in the agreement of sale. I think the biggest thing, and it just came from legal counsel for PAR, is read it. Because once you read it, you're like, wow, I didn't know that, maybe that wasn't in there. And then on PAR's website, if you ever want detailed instructions on how to fill out any form that PAR provides, it's called Guidelines for Preparation and Use. And Tammy, would you please share, because I searched for hours and couldn't find it, where you found this? You're muted.
I have a copy that I can email to everybody. I
That
can
would be great.
chat.
Well, the one that says standard agreement of sale for the real estate PAR form ASR, Nathan gave us that in the email for this class.
Yes,
Yep, that's what I got for him.
Yeah, thank Tammy for that. I looked for it and I knew it was out there, but I couldn't find it. And then Nathan said, oh, Tammy found it.
Okay.
So
So
thank
there's
you,
not
Tammy.
more
But
forms for other, is there guidelines like this for other forms or?
yeah, yes. For every form, I think.
Okay.
Every form, yeah.
I've seen them. So I printed this thing out that Tammy sent us, and the printer just kept going and going and going. 55 pages. So I checked it and pretty much covered, not maybe as well as they would have, but we had already spent an hour and a half here. So
It was good.
Thank you so
All
much,
right.
Kevin.
Any questions on anything or anything we want to? I'm sorry this took so long.
It was good.
But-
Yeah, thank you. We
Long
appreciate it.
contract.
Yeah, yeah. No, thank you. I wish, we'll try to do another one here and break down some of these other forms. I know the hot topic right now is the escalation clause, so.
Yeah.
And I've done that before. And I'd be willing to do that again.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Okay,
I don't care how many times you do these, there's always something you learn.
right.
That's right.
No, I mean, I listen to, like I said, Gary does these and he's so knowledgeable about every form. And I learned a couple things every time I sit in on his, so.
You do.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Good.
Gary did escalation clause last year, I think.
Okay, yeah, I did one, I forget when, but,
Yeah.
all right. Well, listen, held you up long enough. Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
have a
Thank
good rest
you.
of the day. It's gonna be 50
Thanks.
something out.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.